Well, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to Live from the Archive. My name is Tom Ferber, and I'm an Engagement Learning Officer here at London Metropolitan Archives. In the Live from the Archive series, we spend a little bit of time with either a particular theme or story or document that we have on display in our exhibition. And our current exhibition, it's a few months in now, 3 months in now, so I'm going to stop calling it new and just call it our exhibition, is Unforgotten Lives, Rediscovering London's of African, Caribbean, Asian and Indigenous Heritage, 1560 to 1860. And today, in Live from the Archives, we're going to be spending a bit of time with one Sheikh Deen Mohammed, who's a very interesting figure, not only in London at this period, but Brighton, Cork, and his native-born India as well. He has many claims to fame. He's in 2016, he featured on a Google Doodle, but it's probably better known to many of us as the proprietor of the first curry house in London and for being the shampoo surgeon or the shampooer to King George IV. So we're going to spend a bit of time delving into his life and career over the next 15 minutes or so, and there'll be some time for questions at the end, so please feel free to pop them in the chat as they occur to you, or we can have a bit of a Q&A at the end, and we'll have a bit of a Q&A at the end as well. So Deen Mohammed, who you might just be able to make out behind me on this picture here, was born in 1759 in Patna in East India. His father was a sepoy. A sepoy is the word we use to describe an Indian soldier in the British Army or the Army of the East India Company. The East India Company is an interesting beast in the history of the British Empire. Starts as a trading company and then becomes really a military organisation, and then later a kind of a quasi-government as well. And 1759 is an interesting period in the history of what's sometimes called British India, because this is where we see the East India Company really sort of cementing its control over the area. So, as we've heard, Deen Mohammed's father was a sepoy, an Indian soldier in the British Army, and Deen Mohammed's father died when he was aged 11. And then Deen Mohammed gets sort of swept up into the army of the East India Company. He spends his sort of early teens, the sort of later part of his childhood, as what we call a camp follower. So a camp follower is someone that, as the name suggests, follows the army camp around, is genuinely useful. So he starts as really making the tea, being useful, those sorts of things, then becomes a trainee surgeon, which means probably a little less than we think of it today. They would do a surgeon would do some basic kind of medical care, but also various hygiene and things as well. After his father's death, Deen Mohammed is taken under the wing of one Godfrey Breaker, who's a youngish in his 20s army officer, and he's something of sort of quasi-father figure and friend to Deen Mohammed in his early years. In 1782, Godfrey Baker, who's by this point a captain in the army, is involved in some controversy, some claims that he's misappropriating army supplies for his own benefit. He's eventually cleared of those charges, but resigns the army in 1782, and Godfrey Breaker moves back to his native Cork, and Deen Mohammed travels back with him. So Deen Mohammed finds, after kind of growing up in colonial India, Deen Mohammed finds himself aged 25 in Cork. He then, again, under the sponsorship of Godfrey Breaker, improves his English by studying at it's variously described as a local school, a local college, which I feel might be a bit of an anachronism, but it's hard to exactly parse what it means from the sources. And as part of these studies, he meets one Jane Daly, who he will soon marry. Again, you read slightly different and conflicting sources of what's happening at this time, but we know that they elope, which suggests that the marriage wasn't approved of by the family at the time, and also they, rather than posting banns in advance of their marriage, they post a wedding bond as it happens. Again, some suggestion, it's hard to pull out exactly what it means, that the wedding wasn't entirely approved of. And we also know around this time that Deen Mohammed converted from Islam to Anglican Protestantism. Again, the sources conflict slightly about the timing and the reasons for this, but it's reasonable to infer this was probably a way for, firstly, to make the marriage happen, and for him to better integrate into the society that he's now living in. In the early 1790s, Dean Mohammed and Jane Daly moved to London, and they moved to Portland Square, which was a fashionable area, popular with people returning from the colonies, and we call these people the nabobs. Now, a nabob would have been known at the time as someone that had, a British person had gone to India, made their fortune, and kind of then come back and was living a good life on that wealth. And nabob is one of the many Anglo-Indian words that appear in our lexicon around this time. In 1794, we get the first sense of the sort of entrepreneurial spirit that kind of characterises Dean Mohammed's life, and also his propensity to, how should we say, sail quite close to the wind or colour slightly outside the lines. So in 1794, he publishes a book that purports to be an autobiography entitled The Travels of Dean Mohammed, and this is now regarded as the first work published in English by an Indian. It's an epistolary novel, so it takes the form of letters, 38 in total. And as I said, it's sold as an autobiography, but recent scholarship has shown that actually many sections of this autobiography are in fact plagiarised. They happen to somebody else other than Dean Mohammed. Again, as I say, an example of his entrepreneurial spirit and his sort of ability to sort of colour outside the lines when he needs to. This is a side of his character that's also reflected in 1806 in perhaps a way that to a modern eye is a bit harder just to sort of paper over. And in 1806 he gets married again to one Jane Jeffreys, and the records suggest that this is a bigamous marriage. We have no record of his earlier marriage to Jane Daly ending. I should say that the records for a character like Dean Mohammed were both, on the one sense, we're really blessed. Things like the biography, things like his later entrepreneurial activities we'll hear about more, give us a real sense of his life. But we are still dealing with a figure nearly 250 years ago, so there are always going to be gaps in his record and gaps in the account. And this is another such example of a gap. So we know he moves to London in 1794, the second marriage in 1806, and we don't really hear from him again in any great detail until 1812. And in 1812, the headline claim is that Dean Mohammed opens the first Indian restaurant, or the first curry house in England. And as is always the way, we can probably slightly dispute that and kind of slightly nuance that claim, although I do think we've made that claim ourselves in our exhibition take. But sometimes we have to sort of, simplify things for the sake of clarity. So what we can probably more accurately say is that he ran the first Indian restaurant owned by an Indian, and perhaps the first Indian restaurant that we would recognise today as such. Because as we heard, Dean Mohammed's restaurant opens in 1812, but Indian curry was already popular in England by the 19th century, and sort of the spices that are the kind of the raw ingredients for curries have been were present in English cookery since the time of the Crusades in the 11th century. Indeed, we have a cookbook from the late 1740s, Hannah Glass's The Art of Cookery Made Plain and Simple, published in 1747, gives recipes for curries and pilaus as well. What were these curries like? Well, they were probably, well, indeed they were, far more mild than the curries we would sort of experience and enjoy today. Flavoured with salt, peppercorns, coriander seeds, lemon juice, and emphasising more herbs than the spices that we think of as curry today. But by the 19th century, by Dean Mohammed's time, things like turmeric, cayenne, ginger, cumin, fenugreek, and caraway seeds are also being introduced into the diet. We also know that as kind of curry makes its way to England, some of the cooking methods changed as well. One of the kind of cornerstone and very delicious ingredients, of course, of curry is ghee, clarified butter. But this and the idea of cooking meat in clarified butter didn't really come across at this stage to Britain. Indeed, the meat tended to be cooked in stock rather than fat. We also know that the curry is featuring on the menus of coffee houses in 1773, and by 1784, some kind of curry has become a speciality in some of the upmarket restaurants in London's Piccadilly. But none of this, of course, is to lessen the achievement of Dean Mohammed and to lessen the cultural impact of his restaurant. His restaurant was called the Hindustani Coffee House, as we've heard, opened in 1812 in 34 George Street, which is Portman Square today. And it's now 102 George Street due to a later renaming of the rearranging of the house numbers, street numbers, excuse me. And there is a green plaque that marks the spot. So it's described as the Hindustani Coffee House. Coffee houses were a popular feature of Georgian London, and indeed the London preceding and coming after it as well. It was not unusual for coffee houses to have to serve food, and not unusual for coffee houses to have what we today a theme. And as we've heard, this is themed around curry, and more broadly themed around the empire and the colonies. So we know from records at the time that it was decorated in what's described as a colonial style. We also hear that the restaurant offered other items from India as well, including hookah with real Chilim tobacco, and that these dishes would allow the greatest epicures to be unequal to any curries ever made in England. Interestingly, in a parallel to sort of modern dining and food cuisine, they also provided a home delivery service. The coffee house, however, was not a commercial success. There was a kernel of a good idea in it, it turns out, appealing to the tastes of the nabobs, appealing to people that had a taste in, grown used to Indian food whilst on their kind of colonial enterprises. But where it broke down was that people who had sort of the wealth, the people who enjoyed this wealth from their colonial enterprises tended to have cooks at home who could make them their curries at home rather than eating them in the curry house. So by 1814, the curry house has failed, it's gone bankrupt, and from here, Dean Mohammed moves to Brighton. And he starts another business enterprise here, once again using his heritage as part of his marketing, again to use a sort of slightly anachronistic term. So he opens indoor baths in Brighton. So Brighton has become the sort of the bathing capital of England at this point, and bathing, both sea bathing and kind of indoor bathing in what we call sort of a spa environment today, is seen as a source of good health and vigour. And typical of the kind of the health claims made for bathing at this time is a claim made by Muhammad himself. So he claims that his bathing is a cure to many diseases and giving full relief of everything fails, particularly when everything ails, particularly rheumatic and paralytic gout, stiff joints, old sprains, lame legs, aches and pains in the joints. So in his bathhouse, you could have you'd have seawater that was piped in from the ocean, warmed up, and then infused with spices and other scents. And this was again seen as to bring health benefits. And of course, it's far more pleasant to bathe in warm water in an indoor environment than sort of dunk yourself in the cold of an English Ocean. And one of the sort of the marketing claims that was attached to this was the idea of shampooing, and indeed Dean Mohammed becomes known as the shampooing surgeon. So today we think of shampoo obviously as something you use to wash your hair. We talk about shampooing our hair, but shampooing is again an Anglo-Indian word that derives from the idea of champé, I believe it's pronounced. And this is a more elaborate ritual around oils, around head massage, massaging the whole body. That's what sort of shampoo meant at the time, in the way it was anglicised. And Dean Mohammed, as we've said, styles himself as the shampooing surgeon. And this, again, we get another glimpse into the character of Dean Mohammed at this point, because we know in his earlier years he was quite disdainful of the idea of shampooing, seeing it as unmanly and effeminate. But once there's an opportunity for him to use it in an enterprise, his entrepreneurial spirit kicks in, and he's prepared to sort of really get behind the idea. At this point, and perhaps a little earlier as well, we see him dressing and presenting himself in the way that you might be able just to make out in the background here, in clothes, in costume that would have been read at the time as Oriental. He's playing on this idea of the exotic, which was common at the time. And it's around about this time, or perhaps again a little earlier, that he starts lying about his age, and lying about his age in the opposite way that we would do today. So today we tend to want to make ourselves seem younger than we are. But he did the opposite. He said he was a full decade older than he in fact was. And the likelihood of this is that he wanted to show how good and shampooing and similar rituals were for your health, because it made him look a whole decade younger than he in fact was. And this idea of some sharp practice is revealed one final time when it comes to his working in the sort of the health environment. So although many great claims are made for the health benefits of shampooing and bathing, we do know there were at least a couple of rather serious mishaps where the person being bathed actually died as a result of the treatment. One person had a stroke or a heart attack brought on by bathing in extreme bathing in the hot and warm water, and another patient had an arm broken after a particularly vigorous massage, which in turn led to the arm needing to be amputated. And ever shrewd Deen Mohammed effectively bribed the local paper to make sure these stories didn't get out and didn't get too far. It's both his sort of personal appeal, his personal marketing, and his shrewd business sense meant by the reign of George IV and the reign of William IV, he had received royal warrants for his bathhouse. It was given the royal seal of approval. This lasts until 1837, when Queen Victoria comes to the throne. Queen Victoria wasn't, although she was a big fan of curry, wasn't into bathing in the same way as George IV and William IV. And at this point, the business starts to falter, in part because of its loss in prestige, and also because there's a huge amount of competition in Brighton and other places at the time. So the later years of Deen Mohammed's life are a bit quieter. We still see him hustling and bustling, still trying to keep various businesses going until his death in 1851, where his death is remarked upon in the obituaries of the time. So I hope that gives a little bit of an insight into kind of the life and career of Deen Mohammed, and maybe fleshes out his story in a way that we haven't been able to in the kind of small space that allows for us on the captions that we have behind me. And of course, it's nice for you to join us online for those that can't sort of enjoy this story in person. So at this point, I'm very happy to take any questions you might have about the exhibition in general, or of course, particularly about Deen Mohammed this afternoon. So over to you.
None yet.
None yet. Okay.
Sean says thank you for doing this. It's fascinating.
Thank you, Sean. Very. Yes, it's a particularly interesting story, and it's always nice with these stories to see there's a lot we recognise and a lot that seems alien or different. And I think those are the historical stories I find particularly interesting. We can recognise curry houses, home delivery. We can recognise an entrepreneur, but of course, a lot of the context is very different as well.
I didn't realise that about shampoo.
Okay.
How shampoo came from.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Interesting. Yeah. Jack was saying, much everyone could hear, that he didn't realise that shampoo came from Anglo. And there's many. I think pajamas is another famous one.
Yeah.
Divan, and I'm sure we could probably fill the chat with a long old list. All of course contributes to the richness of the English language.
That's a good point. Deborah says it's intriguing that his first name was Deen. It's like that's an Anglo name.
Yeah.
So was there a...
Yes, yeah. So the question just here, the name. So you see his name spelled various different ways. It's likely that Deen is an Anglicization of too much how you pronounce it, but Deen or Din spelled D-I-T-I-N. So it is an Anglicization of a name. Yeah.
Cool.
Thank you. Are there any more questions, Jack, or comments?
No.
Jolly good. Well, thank you all for joining us this afternoon. Hope that was interesting for you, and we'll see you again the same time next month. Thank you very much.